This is a Dutch test report tutorial to assist you as you understand your cortisol results for our Dutch testing. These videos are for educational information only and not to be taken as any sort of medical advice. The results that will show on the screen are just sample results to help with the conversation, but are not from any particular patient. As we're looking at the cortisol, there's a lot of different data that we can look at. Probably the most important bit of that is the pattern of cortisol over time. And then the total production of cortisol. Those are probably the two most important things. So we've got 4 different collections. The waking collection is a waking urine sample, but it's not a reflection of waking cortisol, right? It's a reflection of the cortisol during the nighttime. So essentially a while you were sleeping cortisol. And then the next sample that we're looking at here is the one taken 2 hours after waking. So this is going to be the collection of all the cortisol from waking, at which point cortisol typically surges up until 2 hours later, where that big surge of cortisol is for the most part come down a bit, and then it's down quite a bit further by the time we get to the afternoon, and then at its lowest point around bedtime. So we're looking at free circulating active cortisol 4 different times. So we want to evaluate that in this patient for the diurnal pattern itself, as well as the overall levels, which might be more helpful to be seen in the addition of all 4, so we can look at that. But don't mistake that as a marker for overall cortisol production. That's a marker for overall free cortisol. Free cortisol is only about 1% of the total. It's a very important fraction because it's the active bioavailable fraction. But when we want to know about overall glandular output from the adrenal gland, metabolized cortisol is really the better marker for total cortisol production. So we want to look at those two. In this particular case, the free cortisol is fairly normal in the middle of the reference range there, so the overall free levels are normal, but again, we want to look at what the specific diurnal pattern is up and down throughout the day to see if there's dysfunction there, and then again to get a good look at the production, which is also normal in this particular case. Then we can look at the metabolites of cortisol. So as cortisol is made, it circulates, and it circulates as cortisol and cortisone. So it's deactivated to cortisone and then back and forth throughout the day, throughout the body. So because it spends so much time in its inactive form, we want to confirm that up and down pattern throughout the day by also looking at the free cortisone, so the inactive form throughout the day. So you want to evaluate that pattern as well to see if it confirms the pattern that you've got with the cortisol, or if maybe it reshapes that just a little bit. And again, those totals are then the totals for free cortisol and free cortisone, both of which are metabolized to become cortisol and cortisone metabolites. So when we say metabolized cortisol, which is our marker for overall production, it's the addition of all of those metabolites, not cortisol and cortisone themselves. So in a situation like this, where we've got fairly normal free cortisol, then we also can look at the cortisol production, and if it's in the middle of that normal range, then you've also, at least the implication would be that you have fairly normal cortisol and cortisone clearance or metabolism. As that production gets a bit higher in some particular cases, then you may be looking at increased cortisol clearance, which can be exacerbated in cases of obesity, elevated thyroid, long-term exposure to elevated cortisol. If you have a situation where the metabolites are on the lower side relative to the free cortisol, that is in a sense a picture of somewhat slower or sluggish cortisol metabolism, and you'll see that sometimes in a patient with low thyroid or poor liver function. So we're looking at free cortisol over time, the total of production, and then another thing that we can look at is, in the overall scheme of things, which one is predominating, the active cortisol or the inactive cortisone. And while it's intuitive to look at the free pattern to deduce whether that's favoring one way or the other, the scientific literature would suggest that the better way to ask that question is to look at the metabolites, because again, they represent so much of a larger fraction of the total for cortisol, the total for cortisone. So looking at the cortisol metabolites and the cortisone metabolites, whichever way this is pushing in your particular case shows which one is predominating, and that helps to shape the overall interpretation. So free cortisol over time, total production, and then any metabolic preference that there might be. So I hope that's been helpful. You can find other educational videos at DutchTest.com. If you have any questions from a patient perspective, please do refer those back to your healthcare provider, and we thank you for testing with us.